Welcome to Read and Learn English, where learning English becomes an exciting journey. Today, we embark on the thrilling and controversial story of one of history's most infamous figures, Adolf Hitler. Love him or hate him, his life was filled with ambition, failures, power, and devastation. From a small boy with big dreams to a man who changed the world forever, this is the story of Adolf Hitler like you've never heard before. So, are you ready? Grab your headphones, sit back, and let's dive into this incredible tale that will not only improve your English, but keep you captivated till the very end. Chapter 1. The Early Years. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in a small town called Braunau am Inn, located in Austria. His parents, Alois and Clara Hitler, welcomed their baby boy into a world that was rapidly changing. At the time, Austria was part of a vast empire ruled by the Habsburg monarchy, and life was challenging for many families. The Hitlers were a middle-class family, but Adolf's childhood was far from happy. Alois Hitler, Adolf's father, was a strict and demanding man. He worked as a customs officer for the Austrian government, a prestigious job that required discipline and obedience. He expected his children to follow his path and work for the government. However, Adolf had different dreams that were far removed from the structured and bureaucratic life his father envisioned for him. Clara Hitler, on the other hand, was a kind and loving mother who deeply cared for her son. She was gentle and protective, always supporting Adolf even when he struggled with his father's expectations. She understood his love for art and encouraged his creative side. But despite her support, life in the Hitler household was often filled with tension. As a child, Adolf enjoyed playing outside, drawing pictures, and imagining a big future for himself. He loved reading adventure stories and history books, dreaming of doing something great one day. However, his father had no patience for such fantasies. Alois wanted his son to focus on school, work hard, and become a government official like him. Their conflicting visions led to constant arguments. Whenever Adolf expressed his desire to become an artist, Alois would grow furious. "Art is not a real job," he would yell. "You need a stable career." Adolf, unable to fight back against his father's authority, would often stay silent, hiding his tears. He longed for a future where he could live freely, away from his father's strict rules. Despite the tension at home, Adolf was a bright student in his early years. Teachers noted that he was intelligent and had a strong memory. However, as he grew older, his rebellious side started to show. He disliked being told what to do and often ignored subjects he wasn't interested in, such as math and science. Instead, he focused on history and art, the subjects that fascinated him the most. At the age of 13, Adolf's life changed forever. In 1903, his father, Alois, died suddenly. Some people believed that this would bring Adolf relief, as he no longer had to deal with his father's strict rules. But in reality, his father's death left a void in his heart. While they had their differences, Alois had been the family's main provider, and his absence created financial difficulties for Clara and her children. Without his father's pressure, Adolf started losing interest in school. He became lazy, skipping classes, and refusing to study. Teachers, who once saw him as a promising student, began to complain about his behavior. "Adolf is smart, but he does not apply himself," they would say. His grades dropped, and he barely managed to complete his studies. As his teenage years passed, Adolf's passion for art only grew stronger. He spent hours sketching buildings, landscapes, and people. He was convinced that he was meant to be an artist and began planning for his future. His mother, despite her struggles, supported his dream and encouraged him to apply to art school. She believed in her son's talent and wanted him to be happy. With high hopes and excitement, Adolf prepared to move to Vienna, Austria's capital city, where he planned to pursue his artistic career. Little did he know that his journey in Vienna would be filled with hardships, rejections, and struggles that would shape his future in ways he never imagined. Chapter 2. The Struggles in Vienna. In 1907, a 17-year-old Adolf Hitler arrived in Vienna with a heart full of dreams. He believed that the city, known for its rich culture and artistic heritage, would be the perfect place to start his journey as a painter. Vienna was home to magnificent architecture, grand museums, and prestigious art institutions. It was a city where creativity thrived, and Adolf was eager to be a part of it. His first step was to apply to the Academy of Fine Arts, one of the most respected art schools in Europe. Confident in his abilities, he submitted his portfolio, hoping to impress the judges. However, when the results came, his heart sank. He had been rejected. The rejection letter stated that his work lacked the necessary skill, particularly in painting human figures. The Academy advised him to try architecture instead, as they saw potential in his drawings of buildings. But for Adolf, this was devastating. He had dreamed of becoming a famous artist, and now his dreams were being shattered. Despite the setback, he refused to give up. "I will try again," he told himself. He spent the next year practicing, creating more paintings, and preparing to reapply. However, in 1908, he faced another crushing blow. He was rejected again. This time, the reality hit him harder. The dream he had held onto for so long was slipping away. Without admission to the academy, Adolf found himself lost. He had no backup plan, no stable income, and no place to call home. His financial situation worsened, and soon he was living in poverty. He moved into cheap, overcrowded housing and struggled to afford food. Some nights he had to sleep on park benches or in homeless shelters. To survive, he started selling small paintings and postcards to tourists. He painted pictures of Vienna's landmarks and street scenes, earning just enough money to buy food. But his earnings were barely enough to sustain him. As the days passed, his frustration grew. During this time, another tragedy struck. His mother, Clara, passed away from illness. She had been his greatest supporter, the only person who had believed in his dreams. Her death left him completely alone. With no family, no career, and no direction, Adolf began to sink into a deep state of anger and resentment. He started blaming others for his failures. He felt that life had been unfair to him, that the world had turned its back on him. His time in Vienna exposed him to various political and social ideas. He read books on nationalism and began developing strong opinions about society, race, and power. He observed the city's growing diversity and, instead of embracing it, started seeing it as a threat. The once hopeful artist was now a bitter young man, filled with frustration and resentment. He saw himself as a victim of an unjust world and began searching for someone to blame. The rejection from art school, the loss of his mother, and his struggles with poverty all fueled the growing anger inside him. Adolf spent 5 years in Vienna, struggling to survive. These years of hardship shaped his views and set him on a path that would eventually lead to one of history's darkest chapters. Little did the world know that this young man, rejected by an art school, would one day become one of the most infamous figures in history. His time in Vienna did not make him a great artist, but it did change him forever. It planted the seeds of the ideology he would later spread, a dangerous mix of nationalism, resentment, and a thirst for power. His failure in Vienna was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning of a much larger, much darker journey. Chapter 3: World War I and the Rise of an Idea. In 1914, the world was on the brink of a massive conflict. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria set off a chain reaction that led to the outbreak of World War I. At the time, Adolf Hitler was a struggling young man living in Vienna, barely making a living from selling his paintings. He had no clear direction in life, but when Germany entered the war, he saw an opportunity to be part of something greater. When Germany declared war, Adolf Hitler was ecstatic. He saw the war as a chance to prove his worth, to fight for a cause bigger than himself. He quickly enlisted in the Bavarian army, even though he was still an Austrian citizen. The military accepted him, and he was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. Hitler thrived in the military environment. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose and belonging. He was not a leader in the army, but rather a dedicated soldier. He worked as a message runner, a dangerous job that involved carrying important communications across the battlefield, often under heavy fire. His bravery earned him 2 medals, including the Iron Cross, First Class, a rare honor for someone of his rank. Despite his dedication to the German cause, Hitler was not well liked by his fellow soldiers. He was seen as odd, often keeping to himself and avoiding social interactions. While others discussed their families and dreams of returning home, Hitler remained deeply absorbed in politics and history. He believed that Germany was fighting for its rightful place in the world, and that its enemies were responsible for its struggles. In 1918, after 4 years of brutal warfare, Germany faced defeat. The German army was exhausted, and the Allies were closing in. Then, in November, something happened that would change Hitler's life forever. Germany surrendered. The war was over, but Hitler could not accept it. When he heard the news of Germany's surrender, Hitler was recovering in a hospital. He had been temporarily blinded by a gas attack on the battlefield. As he lay in his hospital bed, he felt a deep sense of betrayal. Many Germans, including Hitler, believed that the war had not been lost on the battlefield, but that Germany had been stabbed in the back by its own leaders and politicians. This idea of betrayal, known as the stab-in-the-back myth, became central to Hitler's beliefs. He was convinced that socialists, communists, and Jewish people were responsible for Germany's downfall. He saw them as internal enemies who had weakened Germany from within. This belief fueled his anger and gave him a new purpose in life. After being discharged from the hospital, Hitler returned to a defeated and struggling Germany. The country was in chaos. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh penalties on Germany. The German economy was collapsing, unemployment was high, and people were desperate. Many Germans felt humiliated by the treaty, which forced them to accept blame for the war and pay huge amounts of money to other countries. Amid this turmoil, Hitler found his calling in politics. He joined a small political group called the German Workers' Party, DAP. At first, it was just another nationalist group with little influence, but Hitler quickly realized that he had a talent for public speaking. When he spoke, people listened. His fiery speeches were filled with anger, promises, and a vision of a powerful Germany. He told the people what they wanted to hear, that Germany could rise again and that its enemies, both external and internal, were to blame for its suffering. This marked the beginning of Hitler's journey into politics, a path that would soon lead to his rise as one of the most powerful and dangerous leaders in history. Chapter 4. The Path to Power. As Hitler became more involved with the German Workers' Party, he quickly stood out as one of its most passionate members. He had a gift for stirring emotions, and his speeches attracted larger and larger crowds. By 1920, the party had changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party. Hitler played a major role in shaping its ideology and expanding its influence. One of Hitler's first major moves was to create a powerful and recognizable symbol for the Nazi Party. He designed the red flag with a black swastika in the center, a symbol that would later become infamous around the world. He also formed a paramilitary wing called the Sturmabteilung, SA, or stormtroopers, who acted as enforcers at Nazi rallies and fought against political opponents. By 1923, Hitler believed the time was right to seize power. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's successful takeover in Italy, Hitler and his followers planned a coup in Munich. This event, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, was an attempt to overthrow the German government by force. However, it failed. The police intervened, and Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison. While in prison, Hitler wrote his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In this book, he outlined his beliefs and political goals. He wrote about his vision for Germany, his hatred of Jews, and his plans for expansion. He believed that Germany needed more living space, Lebensraum, and should conquer new territories to grow stronger. Mein Kampf became a bestseller in Germany, spreading Hitler's ideas to a wider audience. After serving just 9 months of his sentence, Hitler was released from prison in 1924. He realized that using violence to seize power had failed. Instead, he decided to gain power legally, through elections. Over the next few years, the Nazi Party focused on winning the support of the German people through propaganda, rallies, and promises of economic recovery. The 1929 Great Depression played a major role in Hitler's rise. The economic crisis left millions of Germans unemployed and desperate for change. Many people lost faith in the government and turned to extremist parties like the Nazis. Hitler promised jobs, stability, and a return to German greatness. His speeches were filled with energy and emotion, and his message resonated with the struggling population. By 1930, the Nazi Party had become one of the most powerful political forces in Germany. They gained more seats in the Reichstag, German parliament, and continued to grow in influence. In 1932, Hitler ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg. Although he lost, he gained a massive following. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. At first, many believed he would be controlled by the more experienced politicians around him. However, Hitler had no intention of being a mere figurehead. Once in power, he moved quickly to eliminate opposition and consolidate his control. In February 1933, the Reichstag building was set on fire. Hitler and the Nazis blamed the communists and used the event as an excuse to pass emergency laws that restricted freedoms and gave them more authority. Soon, political opponents were arrested, and anti-Nazi voices were silenced. By mid-1933, Hitler had outlawed all other political parties, making the Nazi Party the only legal party in Germany. He created a totalitarian regime where he had absolute power. He introduced policies that boosted the economy, built massive infrastructure projects, and expanded the military. Many Germans saw him as a savior who had brought stability to the nation. But behind this success, dark plans were being set in motion. Hitler had greater ambitions. He wanted to reshape Europe and build an empire. He saw war as the way to achieve this dream. The world had no idea that the man who once dreamed of being an artist was now preparing for one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Chapter 5. The Road to War. By 1936, Adolf Hitler had solidified his grip on power. The German economy had recovered, and the people, who were once impoverished and desperate, now rallied behind him. But despite the growing popularity of his regime, Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond restoring Germany to its former glory. He wanted to reshape Europe, and his dream was to create a vast, powerful empire under the banner of the Nazi Party. Hitler's first major act of aggression was the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. The Treaty of Versailles, which had been imposed on Germany after World War I, forbade the country from having troops in the Rhineland. However, in a bold move, Hitler sent German soldiers into the region. The French, who were supposed to enforce the treaty, were in a state of disarray, and Britain refused to take action. Hitler's gamble paid off. The world did nothing to stop him. In 1938, Hitler took another significant step toward war. He annexed Austria, a move that shocked the international community. The annexation, known as the Anschluss, was presented as a unification of German-speaking peoples, but it was a blatant act of expansionism. The world watched in silence as Hitler's ambitions grew. The next target was Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population, be handed over to Germany. Czechoslovakia refused, but Hitler threatened war. In a bid to avoid conflict, the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy met with Hitler in Munich in September 1938. In what became known as the Munich Agreement, they allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise that he would make no further territorial demands. This policy of appeasement, which was based on the hope that satisfying Hitler's demands would prevent a larger war, failed. Less than a year later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. By this time, Hitler had become increasingly bold, and his thirst for power seemed insatiable. The British and French leaders, who had hoped to avoid war at any cost, now realized that Hitler could not be stopped by appeasement. In September 1939, after Germany's invasion of Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the official start of World War II. Hitler's dream of an empire was now a reality, but it came with devastating consequences. Chapter 6. The Nazi Empire and the Holocaust. With the outbreak of World War II, Adolf Hitler's ambitions reached their peak. The German military, known as the Wehrmacht, quickly conquered much of Europe. By 1940, Germany had invaded France, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The speed and efficiency of the German war machine were astonishing, and many believed that Hitler's vision of a European empire would soon become a reality. One of Hitler's most significant military strategies was the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was a highly effective form of warfare that combined rapid troop movements, surprise attacks, and overwhelming force. The goal was to overwhelm and defeat the enemy before they could react. The strategy proved successful in the early years of the war, allowing Hitler to seize vast territories with minimal resistance. However, as the war progressed, Hitler's expansionist ambitions led to a series of disastrous decisions. In 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was a colossal blunder. Hitler underestimated the strength of the Soviet military and the harsh Russian winter. The German advance stalled, and the war on the Eastern Front became a brutal and costly conflict. Despite initial successes, the Nazis were unable to defeat the Soviet Union, and by 1943, the tide of war had turned against Germany. One of the darkest aspects of Hitler's vision for the future was his racist and anti-Semitic ideology. From the very beginning of his rise to power, Hitler had promoted the idea of a racially pure Aryan nation. He believed that the Jews were a threat to the German people and blamed them for many of Germany's problems. This belief became central to Nazi policy, leading to the systematic persecution of Jews and other minority groups. In 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of their citizenship and basic rights. The laws were just the beginning of a larger campaign of discrimination and violence. In 1938, the Nazis orchestrated Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, during which Jewish businesses and synagogues were destroyed, and Jews were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. The most horrific aspect of Nazi policy, however, was the Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored genocide of 6 million Jews, as well as millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, and others deemed undesirable by the regime. The Nazis established concentration camps, including Auschwitz, where millions were murdered through gas chambers, starvation, and forced labor. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. Hitler's obsession with racial purity led to the mass extermination of innocent people, and the horrors of the concentration camps shocked the world. The genocide continues to serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and bigotry. Meanwhile, the war continued to escalate. By 1944, the Allies had begun to push back against Germany. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. Allied forces, including American, British, and Canadian troops, landed on the beaches of Normandy and began to liberate France and other occupied territories. At the same time, the Soviet Red Army pushed westward from the east. The German military, stretched thin on both fronts, began to collapse. The once mighty Wehrmacht was unable to stop the Allies, and German cities were bombed into rubble. Hitler, who had once been so confident of victory, became increasingly paranoid. He retreated to his underground bunker in Berlin, where he isolated himself from reality. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler made his final decision. He took his own life, along with his wife, Eva Braun, in the bunker. Their deaths marked the end of an era of madness, hatred, and destruction. After Hitler's death, Germany surrendered to the Allies on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was officially over, but the scars of the conflict would remain for generations. Millions of lives had been lost, and the world had been forever changed by the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. The defeat of Nazi Germany marked the beginning of a new chapter in world history. The world vowed never to forget the lessons of the war and the horrors of the Holocaust. In the years that followed, Germany was divided into East and West, and the world entered the Cold War. But the impact of Hitler's reign could still be felt. His legacy serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of hatred and intolerance. Chapter 7. The Final Years and Decline. By 1944, Adolf Hitler's world was rapidly crumbling. Once celebrated as a national hero who had brought Germany back from the brink of ruin, he now found himself leading a nation teetering on the edge of total destruction. The tide of World War II had turned decisively against him. The Allies' D-Day invasion in June 1944 had opened a new front, and Soviet forces had begun to push through Eastern Europe. Hitler's once feared military machine, the Wehrmacht, was now struggling to hold its ground against a united and determined enemy. By late 1944, Germany was losing battles on all fronts. Hitler's plans for world domination had faltered. Yet, despite the obvious signs of defeat, Hitler remained stubbornly defiant. In the final years of the war, Hitler became more isolated than ever. He retreated into his underground bunker in Berlin, where he spent most of his time, increasingly disconnected from the outside world. His once sharp mind began to falter, consumed by paranoia and delusions of victory. In his bunker, surrounded by loyal followers, he refused to acknowledge the dire reality outside. The German people, once enthralled by Hitler's promises of a glorious future, now faced starvation, bombings, and widespread suffering. Hitler's promises had failed them. The people of Berlin, as well as the soldiers fighting for the Nazi regime, knew that their once mighty empire was on the brink of collapse. Hitler's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. His obsession with defeating the Allies and saving Germany led him to make reckless military decisions. He continued to demand impossible victories, even when the prospects of success were minimal. The Battle of the Bulge, launched in December 1944, was a last-ditch attempt to break through Allied lines in Western Europe. It failed, marking the final failure of the German military in the war. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviets closed in from the east, it became clear that the war was lost. Yet Hitler refused to surrender, convinced that victory could still be achieved if his generals followed his orders. He ordered the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, including bridges, factories, and railways, in the hopes of denying the Allies any advantage. These orders, known as the Nero Decree, were a final act of desperation, but they also doomed Germany to even more suffering. By early 1945, Berlin was under siege. The Soviet army had reached the outskirts of the city, and Adolf Hitler knew that his time was running out. His former allies, like Mussolini, had already fallen. Germany's cities were being bombed relentlessly, and the country was facing complete annihilation. Hitler's inner circle grew smaller, with only his most loyal followers remaining by his side in the bunker. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, joined him in the bunker in the final days of the war. Though their relationship had remained largely private, Braun stood by Hitler in his final moments. As Berlin fell, Hitler's once grand ambitions of creating a Nazi-dominated Europe crumbled to dust. His promises of greatness had only brought destruction, misery, and death. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces encircled Berlin, Adolf Hitler made his final decision. Chapter 8: The End of the Third Reich. As Adolf Hitler's final days unfolded in his Berlin bunker, the world outside was witnessing the end of the Nazi regime. The dream of a Third Reich that was meant to last 1,000 years had disintegrated in a mere 12 years, leaving a legacy of death, suffering, and destruction in its wake. The collapse of Nazi Germany was inevitable, but the manner in which it happened marked the ultimate tragedy for both the German people and the world. Hitler, in his isolation, refused to acknowledge the reality that Germany had lost the war. His belief in the superiority of the Nazi regime blinded him to the grim facts. In his bunker, surrounded by his closest followers, Hitler continued to issue orders, but they were increasingly meaningless. His generals had no choice but to ignore his commands as the Soviet forces advanced on Berlin from the east and the Allies from the west. By April 28, 1945, the situation had become dire. The Allied forces were mere miles from Berlin, and Hitler knew that defeat was inevitable. Desperate to maintain control of his fate, he chose to take his own life rather than face capture. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives in the small, dark room of the Führerbunker, marking the tragic end of one of history's most notorious figures. Hitler's death did not bring an immediate end to the war, but it symbolized the fall of the Nazi regime. His trusted inner circle, including Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, and other high-ranking officials, continued to hold out hope that they could salvage something from the ashes of their leader's defeat. But by then, it was too late. The Third Reich was finished. In the days following Hitler's death, the Nazi government crumbled. German soldiers, facing overwhelming Allied forces, began to surrender. The final remnants of Nazi power were shattered. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allied forces, bringing an end to World War II in Europe. The surrender of Nazi Germany marked the end of the Third Reich and the conclusion of a devastating war that had claimed millions of lives. Hitler's death was met with relief and sorrow. For many, it was a moment of justice after years of oppression, war, and genocide. But for others, it was the tragic end of a dream that had once seemed so powerful and inevitable. In the aftermath of the war, the world struggled to come to terms with the horrors of the Holocaust and the devastation caused by Hitler's reign. The legacy of the Nazi regime would leave scars on Germany and the world for generations to come. The Nuremberg trials, held in 1945 and 1946, sought to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. Prominent Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. The trials were a crucial step in ensuring that the atrocities committed during the war would never be forgotten and that those responsible would be held accountable. Germany itself was left in ruins. the once mighty nation was divided into East and West, with the Allies taking control of the western portion and the Soviet Union occupying the eastern portion. The division of Germany would last for nearly half a century, leaving a lasting impact on the country and the world. Hitler's death marked the end of an era, but the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War would continue to haunt the world for generations. His reign of terror had left a permanent scar on human history, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, hate, and the abuse of power. Chapter 9. The Legacy of Hitler's Ideology. Adolf Hitler's impact on history remains profound and devastating, and the legacy of his ideology continues to resonate long after his death. The destruction caused by the Nazis, particularly the Holocaust, left deep scars on humanity, and the world struggled to rebuild in the aftermath of World War II. Yet Hitler's ideas didn't disappear with his death. They persisted in various forms of far-right extremism, fueling hatred and division long after the fall of the Third Reich. One of the most enduring aspects of Hitler's ideology was the concept of racial superiority, which laid the foundation for the atrocities of the Holocaust. Hitler believed that the so-called Aryan race was superior to all other races, and that Germans were destined to rule over Europe. His twisted ideas, rooted in extreme nationalism and racism, were spread through propaganda, speeches, and his book, Mein Kampf. He blamed Jews, Roma, disabled people, and other minorities for Germany's social, political, and economic problems, scapegoating them for the country's struggles and encouraging violence and discrimination against them. The Nazi ideology also fueled the desire for territorial expansion, leading to the aggressive military campaigns that ignited World War II. Hitler's vision of a greater Germany, built through conquest and the subjugation of neighboring nations, drove the country into a war that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. His belief in the right of the German people to dominate others was at the heart of the Nazi agenda, leading to brutal occupations, atrocities, and the destruction of entire communities. In the decades following Hitler's death, the world made significant efforts to prevent the spread of such hateful ideologies. The Nuremberg trials, held after the war, were instrumental in prosecuting the architects of the Nazi regime and holding them accountable for the crimes they committed. These trials set a legal precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity, marking an important step toward justice and reconciliation. However, despite the global condemnation of Nazism, Hitler's ideology continued to be embraced by various far-right groups and extremist movements around the world. Neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism remained present in many countries, often fueled by economic and social frustrations. These groups continued to propagate the same dangerous ideas that led to the horrors of the past, calling for the revival of Hitler's vision of a racially pure society. The resurgence of such extremist ideologies in the modern era serves as a stark reminder of the enduring power of hatred and the importance of vigilance in fighting against it. While the world has made progress in addressing the legacy of the Holocaust, the fight against hate and intolerance is far from over. Education about the atrocities of the Nazi regime, the dangers of racism, and the need for compassion and unity is crucial in preventing history from repeating itself. Hitler's legacy is a cautionary tale, reminding humanity of the consequences of unchecked power, blind nationalism, and bigotry. It serves as a warning of the destructive potential of ideologies that dehumanize others and the importance of standing up for human rights and dignity. Chapter 10. Lessons from History. The story of Adolf Hitler is one of immense tragedy, not just for the millions who suffered under his regime, but for the world as a whole. It serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the seductive appeal of radical ideologies, and the devastating consequences of hatred and division. As we look back on the rise and fall of Hitler, it is important to reflect on the lessons that history teaches us so that we can build a better future. One of the most crucial lessons from Hitler's rise to power is the importance of democracy and the protection of human rights. Hitler's ascent was made possible by the breakdown of democratic institutions and the failure of the Weimar Republic to address the grievances of the German people. In the face of economic hardship, political instability, and social unrest, many Germans turned to Hitler as a savior who promised to restore their national pride and strength. However, in exchange for this promise, they relinquished their freedoms and allowed a tyrant to take control. This highlights the fragility of democracy and the need for constant vigilance in protecting it. The rise of authoritarian leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems can be alluring, but history has shown that such leaders often use their power to undermine democratic institutions, silence opposition, and violate the rights of minority groups. It is essential for citizens to remain informed, engaged, and committed to upholding the values of democracy, freedom, and justice. Another key lesson from Hitler's rise is the danger of scapegoating and the dehumanization of others. Throughout his time in power, Hitler blamed Jews, Roma, disabled people, and other marginalized groups for the problems facing Germany. By portraying these groups as enemies of the state and society, Hitler was able to justify violence and discrimination against them. This process of dehumanization made it easier for ordinary people to turn a blind eye to the atrocities being committed in their name. In today's world, we must be wary of similar attempts to divide us along racial, ethnic, or religious lines. Scapegoating and dehumanizing others is a dangerous path that can lead to violence, persecution, and war. We must work to build inclusive societies where all people are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or beliefs. Unity and solidarity are the antidotes to hatred and division. The Holocaust, which remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, is another crucial reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice. The mass murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, was not an isolated event, but the culmination of years of discrimination, persecution, and indifference. It is a testament to the dangers of complacency and the need for individuals and nations to act when human rights are violated. Today, we honor the victims of the Holocaust by ensuring that their stories are never forgotten. Education about the Holocaust and other genocides is essential in preventing such atrocities from happening again. By remembering the past and learning from it, we can work together to create a world where hatred and violence have no place. Finally, Hitler's story reminds us of the power of words and propaganda. Throughout his life, Hitler was a master orator who used his speeches to manipulate emotions, stir up fear, and rally people to his cause. His ability to inspire and deceive millions demonstrates the importance of critical thinking and media literacy. In the age of social media and mass communication, it is more important than ever to question the information we receive, challenge false narratives, and resist the manipulation of public opinion. The lessons from Hitler's life are not just historical, they are lessons for the present and the future. By remembering the past, we can better understand the dangers of intolerance, authoritarianism, and hate. We must strive to create a world where empathy, understanding, and respect for human dignity guide our actions. The choices we make today will shape the world of tomorrow, and we must choose wisely.